Texas A&M should be looking for some new lawyers because I think their current lawyer is Lionel Hutz.
There's the truth and then the truth.
But there's the truth and the truth.
You know, Elliotte, it's a good thing we're recording this podcast on U.S. Thanksgiving and the NHL is dark because we can all use a break, all use a breath, try to regroup because so far the season has been drama-filled. Welcome to 32 Thoughts, the podcast, presented as always by the GMC Sierra HD, Merrick, Friedman, and Old Dom. Yes, we're determined to make that stick. Before we get to the situation in Edmonton, before we talk about Patrick Kane, before we talk about Columbus, before we talk about the Big Cat in Tampa, before we talk about John Klingberg in Toronto, to the best of your knowledge, and information seems really scarce, what is happening with Corey Perry in Chicago?
You know, Jeff, we're taping this in the middle of the afternoon on Thursday, and this is one of those situations where you're almost afraid to say anything because you're worried what's going to come after you recorded the pod. What we know is this. Corey Perry was supposed to play on Wednesday night against Columbus. Nikita Zaitsev was the extra player at skate on Wednesday morning, and he took the bag skate. And when you take that skate, you're not supposed to play. And all of a sudden, Zaitsev in, Perry out. They don't have any extra forwards. And there's a big mystery going on here about what's happening. I think the first thing everybody thinks about when this is there a trade? Not sensing that right now. Could always change, but I'm not sensing that right now. So we'll just have to see how it plays out. I mean, look, the way that the Blackhawks are handling this, it's obvious there's something, but I just think it's wildly irresponsible to guess.
We'll see how this plays out. This story continues. The Blackhawks next in action Friday against the Toronto Maple Leafs. We're going to get to the Maple Leafs and John Klingberg here in a couple of moments. In the meantime, let's rewind to Wednesday because there were 14 games on the schedule and about 14,000 stories coming out of them. And one of the big ones, and maybe the biggest one, is the continuing spiral of the Edmonton Oilers. 6-3 was the final score, but if I really want to pile on, I'll mention that Michael Bunting hit a post and Sebastian Aho had a goal taken away on Blue Line Review. But I'm not going to do that. So 6-3 is the final. It seemed as if the game was cursed for Edmonton in the beginning. In the pregame, Elliotte with Stuart Skinner sliding into Carolina's zone. And then Darnell Nurse getting a puck in the face in warm-up, wasn't wearing a helmet, caught one, looks like right between the lookers, and was all gauzed up to start the game, although he missed the first couple of minutes. Look, this one was over pretty quick. 2 quick goals, 3 quick goals, 4 quick goals, the exit of Stuart Skinner. Zach Hyman kind of gave the Oilers a little brief glimpse of light as they tried to claw back throughout the game. But this one was ugly early, and then the final was ugly. 6-3 is the final. Whoa. I don't even know what to ask at this point because it all does feel like piling on, but things have come unraveled in Edmonton, and where do we go now?
I honestly believe that the Oilers are going to try to weather this as much as they can without doing anything they're going to regret for generations. And, you know, for example, when this Perry thing happened on Thursday afternoon, I had a bunch of people sending me notes. You think it's Perry and Mrazek to the Oilers? When Antti Raanta left the game after the first period on Wednesday night, people were texting me, do you think he's going to be traded to the Oilers?
Show up in the third.
I was like, what? You think he's going to show up for the third period? Yeah. So, I mean, it's crazy around Edmonton now. A whisper on one end of the league is connected to, is this going to be what the Oilers do to facilitate a trade? A whisper right now in Australia turns into, how does this affect the Oilers and their trade for a goalie? I mean, look, Jeff, watching that game, do you want Skinner to make a save? Yeah, you want him to make a save, but some of those goals were ridiculous. Like, they weren't all on him. Their coverage still, you know, you take a look at this and there's not a lot of practice time right now. It's Tampa, day off. Florida, day off. Carolina, day off. Washington, Friday afternoon. You look at it all, but it's very obvious that they haven't fixed the problems that ailed them before the coaching change. They're still really leaky. Teams are still getting great chances against them. Carolina forechecks a certain way, and Edmonton couldn't handle it. And that, for example, led to one of the goals, the one where people were all over CC online and social. But the bottom line is they were not prepared to handle what Carolina threw at them on that particular shift. Their forecheck. So, I look at them and I see a lot of things that still need to be fixed. And I see a team that is determined not to make a really bad trade. Jeff, there's something I wrote about in the notes on Thursday night that I want to discuss with you further. And one of the things I think that the Oilers are going to have to deal with is this narrative that because McDavid's former agent is now the president of hockey operations and his former junior coach is now the head coach, that McDavid is flexing his muscle and growing his power in the organization. I don't think he likes that one bit. I don't think and I will say this, I don't presume to speak for Connor McDavid. He is capable of talking for himself. But one of the things I am hearing, and my experiences with him, I believe this, is that he resents the idea that he is flexing his muscle over the team and making organizational decisions. And the comparison that I made in the notes is Matt Sundin, who just was all over Sweden with the Maple Leafs. And Matt Sundin was a guy who absolutely hated the idea. Like, if you ever went to him and said, why don't you go out and get this player? He would get upset at that. I saw him snap at a reporter once who said on the radio that Leaf players had told him that they didn't think Jonas Höglander should be playing with Sundin. And someone reminded me that there was another time when Sundin's line mates were Nick Antropov and Alexei Ponikarovsky, that once a reporter went up to him and said, why don't you ask for other wingers? And he got mad at that reporter. He would get really upset about stuff like that. He believed his job was to play. And Jeff, in our business, not only in sports, but in media, there are people who like to wield power over who gets hired or who appears on air with them. I don't think McDavid is like that. I don't think he was behind Jay Woodcroft's dismissal, even though he was consulted about what he thought was going wrong. I don't think, you can tell me if you think I'm wrong, Jeff, but I don't think for a second that Connor McDavid said, we need to fire the coach and bring in my junior coach. And I just think that this is something the Oilers are going to have to deal with, because I think that McDavid hates that people would think he's like that.
You know what I think, Elliotte?
What do you think?
I think if Jeff Jackson took over the Los Angeles Kings or the New York Islanders or the Minnesota Wild or the Florida Panthers, or pick a team, doesn't matter. Do you know who I think he would try to install as head coach?
Who dat?
Chris Knobloch. I don't think that has anything to do with Connor McDavid. That just has to do with Jeff Jackson.
I agree with. I've said that, and I agree with you 1,000%. How many times have we said on this podcast that when Jeff Jackson was an agent, he would talk about Chris Knobloch?
I remember at the Memorial Cup in Windsor specifically, I remember having a conversation with Jeff Jackson about Chris Knobloch, how this guy is going to be an NHL coach one day. Like, that's how far back this goes.
You know what I don't believe about that story?
What's that?
That Jeff Jackson would willingly have a conversation with you.
Oh, if you only knew, Elliotte, if you only knew. That's funny. That was a Memorial Cup where the Windsor Spitfires, Rocky Thompson's Windsor Spitfires, upset Chris Knobloch's Erie Otters, and I can still remember one of my vivid memories of that Memorial Cup. I remember I got there. I was working with Colby Armstrong, and we got there early, and the Seattle Thunderbirds were skating. And so the media relations director said, "Who do you want to talk to after the skate?" And we were like, "Oh, we want to talk to Barzal. And we want to talk about Ethan Bear, etc. We want to talk to Matthew Barzal." And so we got down there, and when the minute that Barzal saw Colby Armstrong, you could tell like his eyes got really wide, and he put up with a couple of our questions. And after about 2 or 3, he just said, essentially, "Can I talk to you about Sidney Crosby now?" And then like he just like grilled Colby Armstrong about Sidney Crosby because it was his favorite player and what it was like skating when playing with Sidney Crosby. Those are one of my enduring.
It's a good story.
Honestly, Frege, you would have loved it because he got like so excited, like, wow, I get to talk to someone who played with Sidney Crosby. Like that's what Matthew Barzal was interested in. He put up with my goofy questions and Colby's goofy questions. And then he just started to grill him about Sidney Crosby. No, but I think that, wherever Jeff Jackson was going to end up once he made that decision, that he was no longer going to work as an agent with Wasserman, and he'd be interested in running a hockey team. I think Chris Knobloch would have gone with him, or that's the coach that he would have taken with him. I don't think it has anything to do with Connor McDavid. And you could say, hang on a second here, like it's obvious, it's right out in the open. But the thing is, optically, it looks like that.
Yes.
Optically, it looks like
hockey sphere, in the hockey sphere where everything is always correct and accurate, there is this growing belief. And you know what? Like I on some level, you can understand it, right? Because you look at it, you say, Jeff Jackson, ex-agent, Chris Knobloch, ex-coach, they're trying to make him happy. So, like, I get it. Like, it's a lot. I've seen people convicted of criminal offenses on a lot less. But I look at this and I say, I know why everyone thinks it, but it's wrong. And it's wrong to the point where the Oilers are going to have to do what they can to smash it because they know how much that's going to make McDavid upset. I think he wants to play. He wants to win. It already is bad enough right now. He's happy to take the blame on himself. He will always accept responsibility for things not going as well as they could. But I think where the line is with him is people saying he's remaking this team in his image. He doesn't want that.
Let me circle back to this idea of weathering the storm and not making a panic move and not getting rushed into making a quote unquote bad trade. The word bad is doing a lot of lifting in a lot of these conversations about Edmonton as I find it, because there's two kinds of bad when it comes to a trade. There's bad right now and there's bad long term. And what I wonder about is, are the Oilers now at a place, and if not when, because I would have to imagine if this continues, it'd have to get to this place. Are they at a place where they'll make a move that is bad long-term, but good right now?
No.
Then what are they doing? Is one of the questions then that people would ask. Because this is Leon and Connor on the clock.
Well, this is the thing, and this is important. This is the kind of the biggest thing that they have to weigh here, is because now it's starting to go to like I watch a lot of the stuff online, and now you have Oilers fans saying, I don't care what we have to give up. We just have to do it. We have to do something. That is the danger zone. That is the desperation zone. Jeff, I have been in the desperation zone, and it is not a pretty place.
At 1:59 a.m. on a Friday night at the Seeps in London.
You said it, not me. Look, we talked about this on a radio show. One of our producers and one of our on-air people, and as I say again, it's the worst producer and the worst on-air person at Sportsnet, so people can decide who those are. They have a bet now I called it the Christmas party. It was the Sportsnet 25th anniversary party. I was corrected. 90 points to make the playoffs in the West. Now, as we sit here and we do the podcast, the cutoff in the wild card is a 500 points percentage. According to multiple sources, a 500 points percentage in an 82 game season is 82
Correct.
Points.
I have a hard time believing that will stay.
And Edmonton is at 306 heading into Friday's game in Washington. Like even to get to 82, they've got a lot of work to do. But one thing I think the Oilers feel is, like, number one, and I really do believe this, their plan was to send Campbell down, hope he gets his game going, and then bring him back, right? And he started off very poorly. He got a shutout this week against Henderson, but that was their goal. So I think part of them are like, nobody's running away with this. We could get hot with these two guys, and we could still make the playoffs. St. Louis did it. Florida did it. You plead to the patron saints of playoff miracles past. The problem is that they're playing so poorly. It's not just goaltending that has to get better. It's their whole game that has to get better. But because the rest of the conference isn't exactly pulling away from them, you have this belief you can do it. But I think right now, what you have to be thinking is you have to be weighing the long-term decisions. Ken Holland's in the final year of his deal. Whoever's going to be the GM next year, whether it's going to be Dave Gagne or Mark Hunter or someone else, you have to start to think, okay, maybe we'll just hold. We'll play our hand. We'll see how this unfolds the rest of the year, and then we'll make our decisions. But, you know, for something a GM pointed out to me on Thursday was, now if you're trading a first rounder, it could be a lottery pick. Mm-hmm. And not only could it be a lottery pick, but then you come into the situation where you're saying, like, okay, let's say we have to top 5 protect it this year. Well, then you have to leave it open in the future. And all of a sudden, you've got a question about where you're going. You think you know, but you don't know. And how much protection can you put onto it in the future that it doesn't bite you? So I look at it now, Jeff. I understand why people say you've got to make a move to save your season, and they're not wrong. But again, you have to have a line of what is acceptable. If your move is like a Sam Montembeault or a Caden Primo or say a Peter Mrazek or something like that, you're doing it, but you're not doing it at a cost where, well, I want you to take this contract too, and a first rounder is going to be part of it. Like a buyout for Jack Campbell is $10 million. What do you think that cost is in terms of draft capital? I don't think you should pay that right now, unless someone gives you an unbelievably good deal.
Here's another question to consider. When we say long-term with Edmonton needs to also consider the long-term ramifications. What does long-term mean in Edmonton right now? Does it mean the end of Leon's contract? Does it mean the end of Connor's contract? What does long-term mean in Edmonton?
That's a good question. I think long-term means, what do you think these players are thinking? That's what long-term is.
So then it's the Leon and McDavid contracts. That's as far out as you're thinking.
I think the other thing too is, if I was in charge and I had McDavid and Draisaitl, I would not be giving up on my season. I would believe in, especially with the way the West has gone this year. Again, it looks like a low cutoff for points, lower than normal. I would say to them, guys, I'm not waving the white flag. I may not help you too much because I can't make a dumb trade, but I'm not waving the white flag. You're going to have the runway you need to show you can save this. That's what I would do. Maybe you get them a little bit of help in goal, but again, I'm not doing anything crazy. But I'd look at them and say, guys, you want to prove that you can still save it? I'm not selling. Go do it. Because then you put the onus on, because again, Jeff, a lot of this is they got to play better. We're all sitting here and blaming the goaltending, and yeah, that's true to some degree, but they are playing terribly. You can say to them, if you really believe that we can rescue this, you guys got to go out and do it. The other thing, too, that makes me nervous about the way the Oilers are this year is that there have been times you thought they were going to pull themselves out of it. After the Heritage Classic, you thought they were going to pull themselves out of it. After they won 3 in a row, you thought they'd pulled themselves out of it. That was last week. And now they're back in it again. That's, I have to say that that's one of the things that actually concerns me the most about them is that they seem really fragile. Like Colorado, they're going through a lot right now, a lot of injuries and things. They are not fragile. They are unfragile.
But they've also won the cup. They've also been there. Like there's a confidence in Colorado that does not exist in Edmonton right now.
Vegas is not fragile. And maybe that comes with winning the Stanley Cup. But I don't think like Florida, they're not fragile.
No. Boston, no.
Boston, they are not fragile.
Nope.
And there's a fragility to the Oilers that honestly I'm very surprised to see. Very surprised to see. Like watching that game the other night against Carolina, when they saw the weakness early, they were like a dog on a bone.
That's Rod Brindamore's team, man. That forecheck,
he saw it and they saw it.
They are so miserable to play against. That is we talked about this last podcast, previous podcast. They are so tough to play against because they are all over you. It's got to be frustrating. And when there's a drip of blood in the water, forget it. Okay, let's park Edmonton. We talk so much about Edmonton.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Patrick Kane scores for the Columbus Blue Jackets. Zach Werenski has a good game. Adam Fantilli has a good game. Columbus wins. The losing streak is over. They beat the Chicago Blackhawks. We've already talked about the Corey Perry Chicago situation. Your thoughts on the game against Chicago on Wednesday? Now, Laine scores the 7-1 goal. Okay, so it's not like the 3-2 goal that went whatever. I get it. Call it an empty calorie goal or whatever. He needed that one. What were your takeaways from Columbus on Wednesday?
So one of the first sports books I ever read was like a pamphlet-like thing on Bobby Clarke.
Oh.
So I was like 7 or 8 years old at the time. So this is like
Flin Flon?
1977.
Did it mention Flin Flon?
Yes, it definitely mentioned Flin Flon.
Okay.
It definitely mentioned Flin Flon. And, Bobby Clarke, I think, had been MVP of the league 3 times already by that point. And the Flyers had won 2 Stanley Cups, and he was a hell of a player. And there was a story in the book I always remembered. Bill Flett, the cowboy, was struggling for the Flyers. And Clarke said, put him with me. I'll see if I can snap him out of it. And Flett scored 43 goals. So I think about that all the time. Like, who's a guy you put someone with so they can feel better? You wondered the other day, you were worried about Adam Fantilli. I am not worried about that guy
hang
all.
on. Park that for 1 second. Let me describe that. Let me color that a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm just worried about having a young player, a rookie player, in a miserable situation in his first year in the NHL. That is a generic statement that is true of any organization. How many times have you seen a team say, you know what? It's not healthy to have our kids here yet. We need to shovel out, I guess I'm going to use a Brian Burke analogy here. We need to shovel out the barn before we're ready to show the horse. That was my concern about Adam Fantilli.
Yeah, I'm not worried about him. No more shoveling is necessary. The kid is ready.
Oh, listen.
The only shoveling is going to come after this podcast.
The only shoveling is on this podcast. Never mind. No, listen. I think. Listen. If I first saw Fantilli I'm gonna turn into that guy. I first saw him when he played with the Toronto Red Wings in the GTHL, and he was head and shoulders above everybody. And he was playing against that Don Mills team that had Shane Wright and Brant Clark and Brennan Othman, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He almost single-handedly beat one of the best minor hockey teams the GTHL has ever produced. And he's a level-headed guy, too. And you've talked to him. I've talked to him. Lovely family, great kid, head on his shoulders, brave, all of it. So I don't worry about him from that point of view. My only concern was young kids around negative cultures early in their career. That's all. That was my only point.
Yeah, I totally understand. I like the fact that I forced you to go into this passionate defense of yourself, but I totally get where you were coming from. The point I'm making is I think it's really instructive that after Patrick Laine gets benched and he needs to get going, who does he get put with?
So he's the new. Hang on. So he's the new Panarin, is what you're saying. You got someone that's struggling, put him with Panarin, or in your case, so you're comparing Patrick Laine to Bill Flett. I think that's an interesting comparison.
I don't know if anybody would have made that. I have to say, this is new and unique.
That's the first time that comparison's ever been made.
Yes. So you know what? That's true. That is the first time that one has ever been made for sure, and probably the last. Anyway, it was a good night for Columbus. Werenski he'd been really struggling too. Big night. The other thing is I looked it up. Fantilli and Laine hadn't played a ton. I think they only played 30 minutes before last night. Natural stat trick, I'll credit. And the numbers weren't great. They had good numbers last night. It's tough to be in Columbus right now. I get it. It's been not a lot of fun. The one thing I would like to say, if there was any doubt that they really, really lucked out by having Adam Fantilli drop on their laps, I think that's over. I think the kid is just such a stud. And watching him Wednesday night was another example. I think he's a great player for them, and he's going to be a great player for them for a long time. Anyway, I think this with Columbus, look, they had a great night. They needed it. Their fans needed it. That's the kind of performance you have to have at home. Make your fans feel good. Mike Priest, their president, was at practice on Tuesday, I think it was. He doesn't do that very often. Whenever he shows up at practice, it's, I don't know if ominous is the right word, but people notice. I think here, I listened to a lot of John Davidson's comments the last couple of days, read them. He talked a lot about their veterans, and I don't think he's wrong. Like, some of their kids have played really well. I just wonder if this is going to end with conversations about where are we going here? And do our veterans want changes of scenery? And what does that mean? And I'm not going to name names because I think that's a dangerous thing to do. But we've both been around this a long time. You can talk to people who've been in the league a long time, and eventually you get to a conversation is, do you want something different? And I don't know that that's happened yet, but you could see where it would go on this path to do it.
Okay, let me circle back to Chicago here quickly, because we've talked about Corey Perry, and they were on the other end of that rink on Wednesday in that game against the Blue Jackets, and that is Chicago. The other story around Chicago is the end of the season knee surgery for Taylor Hall. Do you think, considering that opens up even more cap space, and they still have 8 open contracts to get to their 50, that they could play third party here in advance of trade deadline?
I think they certainly could if they wanted to, but one of the things that they have talked about was they don't want to eat contracts that much anymore. They did a lot of it, and they reached a point where they didn't really want to do it again. Now, maybe that changes. Maybe you're offered something that makes you readjust your thinking, but the last time I spoke to them, that's kind of where they were. The other thing I do wonder now too, Jeff, with the Blackhawks is, they lost Taylor Hall, and you wish him the best. He's going to need surgery. I just wonder if they're going to have to go out and get guys who can play. Just serviceable NHLers to surround Bedard. Obviously, you're not going to give up a huge price for them. Why would you? Unless it's somebody you can keep for a long time. But you need bodies. You have to put Bedard in a position where, it's already all on him to begin with in a lot of ways, but you have to help him a little bit.
Those players exist, and that could help those teams out by freeing up cap space.
And you say, look, like, we're interested in this guy, but you have to, and we'll give you a later pick, but you have to give us a pick too. Like, you can still flex your muscles that way. To me, there's an honest hockey reason now why Chicago could do that. And it's not just a dump. It's accumulating picks and getting yourself some players who just make life a little bit easier for everybody there.
Patrick Kane. I would imagine we are pretty close here to a decision from the future Hall of Famer. Any team specifically you've had a chin scratch about lately?
I give Kane a lot of credit here, grudging credit, I would say. He has not made this easy on a lot of us. And anytime I'm in a situation like this, I wonder what I'm missing. Because to me, I think I definitely believe I'm missing things here. Number one, I think he ultimately wants to win. Number two, I think he wants... The people I've spoken to about this, they believe his preference is to stay somewhere for more than a year. I think he's been asked if he's willing to bend that, and maybe he does, but they believe the preference is he doesn't only sign for 1 year. I think they've also gotten a sense that he realizes it's easier on his body if he's in the Eastern Conference. And so we're kind of sitting here and trying to knock everything down based on that. Now, I think, Colorado we've talked about, I think they're looking for offense. I could see them making a pitch. I think he was interested in Dallas. I think they prefer to go defense. And they don't have a lot of cap room. I know we talked to Toronto. It doesn't seem like the best way for Toronto to spend whatever flexibility they have. I know there's some people who suspect Vegas, again, Western travel. So I keep coming back to Florida and Detroit and Buffalo. And I know there's some people who suspect the Islanders simply because there's a cloud of secrecy on this. The secrecy king is Lou Lamoriello, and Kane is exactly the kind of player the Islanders have been looking for. But the Islanders don't look like they can win right now. So what does Kane think about that? Jeff, to me, I do think he's legitimately thought about Buffalo. I do think he's legitimately thought about Detroit. To me, the best fit is Florida. But the question is, what can they do contract-wise? They're right at the cap. And the other thing about the Panthers is there's a real suspicion that they want to keep as much flexibility as possible to see what they can do in the summer. They're trying to sign Montour. They're trying to sign Forsling. Reinhardt's having a big year. But ever since they made the big trade last year for Tkachuk, people think that Zito, he's always got something he's considering. And look, everybody believes he's big in on Kane here. Big. So they look at Zito as, I'm ready to roll the dice. I'm ready to try something you aren't suspecting. There's a big fish in the pond. I've got my dinghy and my rod, and I'm ready to go for it.
It's going to take more than a dinghy and a rod and a worm on a hook to try to get Patrick Kane. He's something almost significant.
My analogies are always terrible. But the teams suspect that Florida thinks that way. What's the biggest thing we can try to do? So, but when it comes to the Panthers again, is Kane? It's probably going to mean then, because next year you can do an over 35 deal with Kane. You can't do it this year, even though he just turned 35. He turned 35 after June 30th, which is when the league calendar starts for the year. So I think that's the thing here. If Florida's willing to bend and give him term, I think we're having a different conversation. But if they're only willing to do a 1-year deal at a low number, people are kind of curious to see how Kane's going to feel about that.
Okay, Toronto Maple Leafs. We talked about how this week would bring more clarity on the John Klingberg situation, and it has to some extent. John Klingberg placed on LTIR by the Maple Leafs. Elliotte, what now?
Well, I think one of the things here is that the Maple Leafs know they have a process they have to go through before declaring anything, because they know that other teams are watching them like a hawk. Toronto's use and other teams' use of LTIR too. Like there's no question that the whole idea of LTIR right now is a controversial topic, and teams think that other teams manipulate it. And even though Kyle Dubas now is in Pittsburgh, his LTIR master manipulator, Brandon Pridham, remains in Toronto. And so everybody is watching this. Everybody. Is this going to give Toronto the help they need? So I don't think they can immediately, like the whole thing with Matt Murray was they went through a whole process in the offseason proving to the league that Murray's injuries weren't going to allow him to play. And the surgery he was going to get wasn't going to allow him to play. And finally, the league signed off on it, and Murray's on LTIR. So right now, that's what they're going through. They're going through the whole process of, okay, he's not having surgery yet. He's going to rehab. And I think they're going to just say, you're not going to be able to declare anything right now. You're going to have to wait and prove that he can't play. Now, do I think ultimately he ends up being shut down? Yes, I think there's a better than 50% chance that happens. But I think the league is going to force them to go through stage by stage by stage by stage until they get there. And we're just starting the process now. I mean, the guy played 2 weeks ago, right? So there's nothing that happened in 2 weeks, like no serious injury on the ice, that the league is going to let them say he's done. They're going to make him go through a process.
Okay, and our process is this. Quick pause, back with the Montana's Thought Line and more on 32 Thoughts the Podcast. Listen to the 32 Thoughts podcast ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Elliotte, time now for the Montana's Thought Line. Montana's Barbecue and Bar, Canada's home for barbecue.
Try the ribs.
32 Thoughts.
Especially on American Thanksgiving. Try the ribs.
32 Thoughts at sportsnet.ca is the email. 1-833-311-3232. Again, email 32 Thoughts at sportsnet.ca. 1-833-311-3232. We've been getting some really good ones, and we'll put a couple of them together. These two, Sam in Boston, Wyatt in Colorado, both have questions about the schedule. And Sam is trying to make that Jelly Dom name stick, by the way. If you're not familiar with that, check out the last podcast. So after the Rangers' recent week off, that technically wasn't their bye week, I started thinking about the structure of NHL schedules. Who makes the league schedule every year? Is it Gary Bettman, an algorithm, automated system, a combination of both? Or perhaps does each team get a say in how their schedule is set up? Also, Wyatt in Colorado mentions on Tuesday's radio show, you and I talked about scheduling conflicts that resulted in no games on Tuesday and Thursday this week. Well, Thursday was the Thanksgiving, the U.S. Thanksgiving, and the NHL is dark on that anyway. As part of the explanation, Jeff mentioned that the U.S. teams typically request home games during the week of U.S. Thanksgiving. That's true. I've always assumed that the league basically just tells teams where and when they will be playing after working through building conflicts and CBA requirements. How much say do the NHL teams get in making of the schedule? So there's a couple of different questions in there. How is it made, and how much say do the teams have, Elliotte?
Well, why don't you start by talking about this week, because you talked a little bit about it, so you should start.
So this week was a unique one. So the big one, I mean, Thursday, not so much because the NHL is stuck on U.S. Thanksgiving. But the situation for Tuesday was a unique one, and a number of different things conspired, quote unquote, against the NHL or against fans, I suppose, who wanted to watch hockey games. So the way it worked was there were only 3 buildings that were available to host games on Tuesday. Vancouver, Calgary, and Arizona. And as I mentioned on the radio, Canadian teams usually get sent to the United States on Thanksgiving week for Thanksgiving Eve and Black Friday games, because that's when American teams request games. And Arizona didn't want to play back-to-back games Tuesday and Wednesday. 12 teams playing Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, so you couldn't schedule a Tuesday, or that would mean 4 games in 5 nights. Elliotte, and you're a CBA expert. I know before you tuck yourself in every night, you read the CBA, and you know that is a no-fly zone. And also the 4 teams who went to Sweden were not available. That's why there were no games on Tuesday.
That's good stuff. You did a lot of work here.
Just a unique circumstance. That's all the Tuesday was. I know it's kind of a bummer because fans are like, well, do I have to talk to my family today? Really? Thanks, NHL. But that was just a scheduling quirk. But do you want to go over how tough a job Steve Hatzapetros has with the NHL and all of his scheduling grids and requests for dates and the like?
Well, basically what happens is the league, a long time out from when the schedule gets released, which is usually around the end of June, beginning of July, the league will ask the teams for dates. Let us know when your buildings are available and if there's any special requests that you have. And that's basically what it comes down to. You submit a list of dates that your building is available, and the league will work around and get you as much as they possibly can. Now, there are some teams that absolutely make requests. You know, the Canucks used to go to the league. They might still do. I haven't asked in a while. But they used to go to the league with a plan that their sleep doctor used to set for them and say, all right, this is the optimal schedule we have based on where we are. And they would try to get it. They wouldn't always be successful, but they would state their case. There are some teams, especially a lot of the U.S. teams, where 3 levels of football really matter: high school football, college football, and the NFL. We know the NFL is king right now. It's unbeatable. But if you have big nights for high school football and college football, they would ask for as many home games as possible in the second half of the year. They did not want, because that's Friday, Saturday, Sunday. They wanted as few games to deal with those leagues as possible. And so that absolutely happened. There was a team, and they said, you can use the example, but we don't want you to name who we are. And I said, fine. They said that they had a big night in their community that was a Bible study night. And I will say this was about 15 years ago. And they always said to me, and so I didn't even check if that's still the case, but I remember them telling me once that locally in their market, there was a certain night of the week, their research did, there was a lot of Bible study among their fan base, and they didn't like home games on that day. So they would ask the league, can we not have home games on that day? So there are things like that come up all the time. However, what the league will tell you is there are fewer and fewer available nights every year. Teams are just packing these buildings, especially post-COVID. You can have, maybe you have an NHL team, maybe you have an NBA team, you have concerts, and some of these buildings are the only venues in their cities where you can host big concerts. So, there are teams who say there's less flexibility than ever. I've asked the league about that, and the one thing the league will say back is there's less flexibility than ever for a reason, because teams are booking their buildings and there's less dates for us to make the schedule work. So it's a challenge. Nobody's ever happy, but it's a challenge, no question.
Thanks to both of you gentlemen for those similar yet a little bit different questions about the schedule. Greg from Fort Francis, Ontario, question for either of you. Are the teams compensated when they travel and play 2 games in the Global Series or even for the Heritage Classic games? The teams are not generating revenue from playing at their home rink as well as the increased travel costs to Europe. Does the NHL compensate the team for these events? I think it's great to showcase the game and the NHL in these events, but at the end of the day, the teams are a business and money talks. Thanks, Greg from Fort Francis.
Well, Greg, it is a great question. And for example, if you are the home team in a Global Series game, you get bought out of a home gate. You notice who was not a home team in either game? The Toronto Maple Leafs. Because then the league would have to buy the Maple Leafs out of a home gate. Yeah. So the teams that they played, and they played Minnesota and they played Detroit, those teams, the league says, okay, on average, you make X for a home game. We're going to cut you a check for that amount of money, and now we're in control. And, costs are part of the overall salary cap management. The cap is revenue minus costs, right? So the players pay 50% of those costs. To take overseas, unless, now I should say, I don't know if, like, for example, the promoter who puts on the Global Series games or whoever it is, I don't know if they pay the cost for that. Let me qualify this because I'm flying blind on answering that question. But I do know that generally costs are split 50-50. So I hope that's the answer to your question, because that's what I could tell you.
For the players themselves outside of the teams, when it comes to
you get per diem.
Well, but for things like Winter Classic or Heritage, I don't think they get anything extra at all. But I do wonder about things like Global Series, going to Sweden, going to Australia, if they do, I don't know, like an enhanced per diem for something like that.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that one.
I'm just throwing it out there because I've always wondered about it. If for something that's sort of above and beyond, if you get an enhanced per diem. I don't know the answer to that.
You get to appear on a Swedish talk show in an undershirt. That is your bonus.
Well, women pinch your muscles. Pinch your muscles. Let's not forget about that as well. Here's an interesting one. Alex from Tawasin. We're going to get to a couple of voicemails, but first this one. Alex from Tawasin. Hey, gents. What happens if a coach is fired with years remaining on his contract and the same team wants to bring him back? For instance, if the Oilers had a new GM that came in for next season and the new GM wanted Jay Woodcroft
back, I wonder why this question came up today.
Would the coach be forced back behind the bench as he is still under contract with that team? Shades of Harold Ballard and Roger Nilsson in the 70s, Elliotte Friedman.
I know why this question came up today, because I had people sending me this DM on Wednesday night as the Oilers were losing. I don't know the answer to that question. Now, for example, there are coaches who they get fired by a team and the team says, you still got to scout for us. Like, if we want you to put together a report on someone, you've got to do it. But generally you can't force them to do work that they're not contractually obligated to do. I have never heard of this occurring. As a matter of fact, I only heard about it happening on one occasion. And I actually forgot to ask Ken Hitchcock about this. When he was fired as the head coach in Dallas, there was someone at the and this was before I was doing like insider duties, but at the World Championships, the rumor was that Dallas was going to consider bringing him back. And obviously it didn't happen. Nothing ever occurred for it. But I've never heard of this occurring before. It is a really interesting question. My theory would be that if they wanted to bring him back and the coach agreed, it would probably be the same contract, but I don't know that for sure. But it's a great question. And actually, I was reading this week. Usually in these contracts, there's something called offset language, which means that if a coach is fired and another team hires them or we put them on TV, the team saves the money based on what the other team or we pay them. Like, for example, if, say, I don't know, pick a coach, gets fired this week, and we say, come on Hockey Night in Canada, and we pay them $10,000 to work one Saturday night, the team saves $10,000. Well, last week in college football, a guy named Jimbo Fisher got fired as the coach at Texas A&M, and he's going to walk away with $76 million. And the reports are that there's no offset language in that contract. So he'll make his money plus whatever he gets next. Texas A&M should be looking for some new lawyers because I think their current lawyer is Lionel Hutz.
There's the truth and then the truth.
But there's the truth and the truth.
That's good,
Love
man.
that line. Love that line. Now, the NHL has stepped in before when teams try to, quote unquote, steal another coach for cheap, right? Like a coach gets fired.
That has happened before.
2 years remaining on a deal, and another team steps in and says, hey, I can get this guy for $800,000.
For $1.
For $1, because you're still getting paid from the other team. The NHL will step in and say, hold on a second here. Let's negotiate and work on something appropriate here. So you're essentially not stealing a coach for cheap and having another team pay for it.
Yes, there is a formula, a market value formula. I think that gets bent in some directions here and there, but there generally is a quote unquote market value formula. Okay. Yes.
Let's get a couple of voicemails here to wrap up the Montana's Thought Line. First, we go to Quad Cities and Kyle.
I was listening to you guys talk about the Devils and Rangers game the other night and about how those two teams don't like each other and how it's really stemmed from the playoffs a year ago. And I've been thinking for a while, it just seems like the NHL's rivalries have been kind of dumbed down a little bit and lacking some muster. It seems like we need a little more maybe nastiness to the games. And by nastiness, I'm not talking about goonery or anything like that. It's just more trash talk and hard body checking and that kind of thing. So I was just wondering what you guys think about the current state of rivalries in the NHL. Do you think they're fine the way they are, or do you think the NHL needs to kind of promote them a little bit more? And if in that regard you think they do, what you think the league could try to do in terms of getting rivalries back important as they used to be when I was growing up back in the 90s. So anyway, thanks again, guys. Appreciate all that you do.
It's a great question. And I think I feel a lot the same way. Like a lot of the hate is gone from the regular season. There's no question about it. But what builds up hate? Playoff rivalries. And, you know, like I said, I think the Rangers and the Devils, they really hate each other. And I think that's awesome. I think the Avalanche and the Golden Knights, I think they really hate each other. And that's awesome. Like it'll never be like the 80s where you had bench clearing brawls, or the 70s like bench clearing brawls. And, you know, the other thing now too, Jeff, is simply that, you know, fighting isn't as big a part of the game anymore. It's up this year and it's interesting to see it, but it's still not anywhere near the way it was 30 or 40 years ago. So I think you have to find your hate in other ways. And you know what, Jeff? You know, we talked about Shesterkin popping off about the Devils. Like, did they win the cup?
Great.
No,
It's
like
great.
big freaking deal. Maybe that's the way that the league is going to change, is that players aren't going to bother to hide their feelings anymore, and they're just going to say what's on their mind. And that'll be the way that the rivalries perk up, with the talk. Like you look at the NBA, there was a wild scene on Wednesday night with Chris Paul and a referee named Scott Foster. Like, I cannot believe the NBA allows that to continue, that Scott Foster clearly hates Chris Paul and continually throws him out of games. And like Paul's record in games when Foster referees, it's like 500 points worse than his career record as a player. It's really something. And, you know, he threw them out of the game on Wednesday night. And And you have the best take on this of anybody I've ever heard, and that is that in south of the border, like it's the whole world is just a stage, and everybody accepts that. But I can't believe that the NBA allows that. But that's the way the league functions on the drama. Like the NBA of all the leagues has the most drama, and some of it is crazy, but it builds up the interest. And I don't know if we'll ever get there. I just don't know if that's possible. But I think we all feel if, people just dropped their guard a little bit and gave us a little more into what they were feeling, it would be nice and spicy. And maybe that's the way you'll build up the rivalries.
Two things need to happen for it to really, really hit. One, and you already mentioned this earlier, playoffs between two teams. And two, geography. 3 is the bonus, and that is someone doing something dumb. But if you have the first two, you have the beginnings of it. Like when Seattle came in, what was one of the selling points for Seattle? Instant rivalry with?
Vancouver.
Right. And one day, somewhere down the road, who knows, maybe even this season.
Maybe they're going to play for the Rain Cloud Cup.
Okay. The Stereotype Cup? Oh, well done, Elliotte. Okay. Whether it's Buffalo, Toronto, maybe, and this might even be a stretch, but nonetheless, I'll throw it out there. And at times it's been spicy, Minnesota and Winnipeg. Playoffs, geography, someone does something dumb, boom. We have a spicy rivalry between teams. Last voicemail goes to Tim. Oh, just mentioned Winnipeg. Tim and the Peg.
Just wanted to hear your thoughts on I've been noticing that Connor McDavid seems to not be tucking in his jersey anymore. Just wondering if this is something you guys picked up on. I just feel like he was always a big tuck-in guy, and just noticed that he's going no tuck lately. Anyways, that's all. Just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks. Love the pod. Take care, guys. Bye.
Tim, thank you. Do you have a thought on jersey tuck?
You know what? I'm just doing a search right now.
Technically, the jersey tuck violation is still on the books. They could still call
Yes, which has never been called. Like I remember.
No.
I'll tell you a funny
has.
story.
It has been called. It was like this is like 10 years ago. Alexander Svitov got called on a jersey tuck. I remember everybody went crazy. Like NHL players were like, this is ridiculous. This? Trust me, I love stuff like this. The NHLers, I remember Malkin went nuts about it, and rightfully so. I think a lot of players did. Like, how can you call this? This is ridiculous. Like, the NHL has a sort of uniform policy, and they want everything to be, all the equipment to be covered up, etc. My own personal theory is they want the they want the jersey out for one day. They can use the jerseys as billboards to sell advertising. Call me a conspiracy theorist, Elliotte, but that's kind of what I think here. But they can call it, but what they'll do is they'll ask the player to untuck the jersey, and then if the player doesn't, then they'll call it. It won't be an automatic call. That's the way it would work. But yeah, Alexander Svitov was called.
So I was in a dressing room and I saw the poster. This is the way we expect you to be dressed. And I was like, that's an interesting article or interesting thing. I can write something about this. So I did. I wrote a piece about this is how it's going to look. And Glenn Healy, who was still working with me at the time, called me like 10 minutes after the article appeared and said, this is the dumbest thing you've ever written. They are never going to call this. And I said, they're telling me they're going to take it seriously, Glenn. I don't know. He goes, you will never see a call. And until today, when you just told me this, I never saw a call. He was right. But you know what it did?
What's that?
I am contracted to write one blog a week. That one allowed me to fulfill my contractual obligations. So you know what? Good. I'm looking at this right now. I am looking at some recent highlights from McDavid, and Tim, you are right. He does not have the tuck. His jersey is down. And you want to know what my theory on that is?
Try anything in a slump?
That's one good theory, but it's not mine.
Okay.
I wonder if he's wearing something to protect whatever injury he's got.
Ooh, I like the way you think, Elliotte. You snuggling up on my side of the grassy knoll now. I like that. Interesting. Tim in Winnipeg, thanks for the call. Kyle in Quad Cities, thanks for the call as well. That was the Montana's Thought Line. Montana's Barbecue and Bar, Canada's home for barbecue. Back to wrap up the pod in moments. Okay, Elliotte, considering this week, well, we just had Tim in Winnipeg ask about the jersey tuck situation with Connor McDavid, and you put forth a certain theory. Some might call it a conspiracy theory. I've talked about my theory that one day the NHL would like to use as much of the jersey as possible to sell advertising, and that's why they want that uniform look and that uniform feel. What about, as we talk about jerseys, on the 60th anniversary week of one of the great conspiracies of all time, Who Shot JFK? Do you have a conspiracy theory on the leak of the Winter Classic jerseys?
By the way, have you watched that new documentary on the JFK shooting?
I've listened to the new Sold Out O'Brien, Rob Reiner podcast about it. I just started episode 3 this afternoon. And
I hear it's quite good.
It's really, really well done. It's excellent. Yeah, it's really well done.
I think Rob Reiner has generally gone insane, but this sounds like it's quite.
It's well done. It's really well
it's
done.
quite good.
And Soledad
I
O'Brien
agree. Fascinating topic.
Soledad O'Brien is fantastic too.
On this one, there's no question in my mind. People think, oh, this accidentally got leaked. No, it's leaked on purpose. And I actually think it's smart. Build up the buzz. Build up the buzz. I will say this. A friend of mine who used to be a fan of the Seattle Supersonics didn't like that it was a Utah Jazz player who wore it because I forgot the Jazz and the Supersonics were big rivals. Gary Payton and Sean Kemp against Karl Malone and John Stockton. And he didn't like that. But you know what I thought was very interesting about that whole scenario, Jeff? Who owns the Utah Jazz?
Ryan Smith. Sir.
I don't think these things happen by accident.
You're all now. You're totally going JFK
I
style.
know.
Was it the
You're
the
rubbing
Soviets,
off on me
the Cubans,
in the wrong
or the mafia? Who was it after all, Elliotte?
You're really rubbing off on me in a bad way. But it was AEW, which I know a lot of young fans think is really cool. So this is not an accident. This is not an accidental leak. They do it on purpose. I will say this. I was worried about the Vegas jersey, but when I saw the actual reveal, the official one, I liked it a lot more.
I still think the Seattle one is awesome.
I know you want the
Seattle,
strings. Yeah.
Well, I do want the strings, but then technically, you know, by and large, they did not wear strings. I just think strings give it a real nice old timey feel. But
I think they look really good.
They look fantastic. The Seattle ones look so good. They look so good. Congratulations, Seattle. You nailed it on this one. Then they've nailed most things, though, so no surprise there. Okay, on that, we'll wrap up, and thank you for listening once again, sharing your time with us. We always appreciate it. That's it for us here. On behalf of Elliotte and Old Dom, signing off. Enjoy your weekend of hockey. You'll hear from us again on Monday. Adjourn.